Senator Coons.
Thank you, and thank you to Chair Durbin and to Ranking Member Graham for both convening this hearing and for your ongoing work to find a bipartisan path forward. Ms. Bride, Ms. Lemke, thank you for your testimony today and for making clear and purposeful what we all know, which is that far too many Americans are spending time on social media, and in particular for young Americans, it can have harmful, even destructive or toxic impacts. We have limited research about exactly what the effects are of the design choices that social media platforms are making on childhood development and on children's mental health. We all know they design their platforms to hold our attention longer and longer, and we know from your testimony and many of us through personal exposure that it is not helpful, but we need to better understand why it's harmful and how it's harmful so we can craft solutions that'll move us forward. I've worked with Senators Klobuchar and Cassidy on a bipartisan bill, the Platform Accountability and Transparency Act, that would make social media companies work with independent researchers to validate and ensure that we understand how these platforms impact our children. The Surgeon General of the United States came and spent a day with us in Delaware and visited a youth center and listened to some of our youth from Delaware and some mental health professionals and public health professionals to talk about this nationwide public health crisis. Dr. Prinstein, you call in your testimony for a greater transparency and reporting requirements for social media companies, including better data access for researchers. What kinds of questions about children's mental health would we be able to answer with greater data access? And what data do researchers need that they don't currently have access to, and what are the barriers for their access?
Thank you so much for your question. There are numerous barriers. We don't have the funding to be able to do the research that we need to do. We actually find that number of academics who are pursuing a career in research on social media are recruited by social media companies themselves and offer salaries that make it very hard to compete in an academic environment. The data that social media's companies have would allow for a better exploration of exactly what it is that kids are viewing, how they're using social media, what they're seeing, how that's related to future behaviors, including what they log on, what they share, how they share that information. It would be tremendously valuable for scientists to be able to understand those questions and link it specifically to mental health. In fact, there is no such access right now, which is severely hindering our ability to work scientifically in this area.
Thank you. Mr. Golan, you also call for Congress to implement transparency requirements to allow independent researchers to better understand the impact of social media on young Americans. The Platform Accountability and Transparency Act would require platforms to disclose information about how their algorithms actually operate so that we could conduct that research in a reliable and stable way. Do you agree this would help parents ultimately to make better informed decisions about the social media products their children consume?
I think transparency and researcher access is a critical piece of the equation. We shouldn't have to rely on courageous whistleblowers like Frances Haugen to understand what the companies already understand about how these technologies are impacting our children. So I think it's incredibly important that we have transparency requirements and researcher access. I will say, though, that we can't stop there. We need also, at the same time, to have a duty of care for these platforms to limit their data collection and what they're doing with that data. So I wouldn't want to see a transparency be kicking the other policies down the road. We need to limit what the platforms are doing at the same time that we get a view into what they're doing.
I agree with you. Look, many of us have the strong sense, based on testimony we hear, based on our own experience as parents and community leaders, that this, as Senator Blumenthal called it, a toxic experiment on our children is going badly wrong. I look forward to joining in support of the Kids Online Safety Act, for example. But I also think we need to get underway with better funded, broader spectrum research so we know exactly what is happening and what isn't and how we can fine-tune our responses. Mr. Pizzurro, if I might, I appreciate your work to protect children by leading New Jersey's Internet Crimes Against Children Task Force. What were the biggest problems you faced when investigating leads generated by cyber tips, and how can Congress provide resources or improve the quality of those investigations?
Well, there's a lack of uniformity. So what would happen is that there's so many tips. So like New Jersey, for example, I think this year had 14,000. When I was there in 2015, it was 2,000. And the challenge is that there are tips within that will result in a significant arrest, but the challenge is the volume, and the ESP and the providers that are actually giving us that information do not give us that information. And if you go from a tip perspective, if I asked everyone in here who had an iPhone, we don't get any tips from Apple, right? So that's now double that. So I think those are the challenges. We need to have that better information. We need to have viability where we can actually protect witnesses.
Last question, if I might. Ms. DeLon, in your testimony, you said most sextortion offenders are located outside the U.S. You mentioned particularly Nigeria and Cote d'Ivoire. How could we better work with international partners and law enforcement to combat this growing problem?
Thank you, Senator. Yes, the problem with sextortion, we're seeing a rapid increase of exponentially more reports now regarding children who are being targeted for money. It's aggressive. We talk to these victims, we talk to their parents on the phone, and it's heartbreaking. There has been a coordinated effort amongst law enforcement to identify where these offenders are coming from. This is an organized crime syndicate. Certainly there are offenders all around the world. We are seeing that there's a criminal component with Nigeria and Ivory Coast in some instances. And we're also working with the tech companies, because the tech companies, it takes all partners here to be able to find the solution, and sharing elements between companies, because offenders and children move from platform to platform. It's really important to be able to share that information so we can stop, intervene, make an adequate, good report that law enforcement would then be able to safeguard a child and hopefully hold an offender accountable.
Thank you. Thank you all very much for your testimony. Senator Graham?
Thank you all. It's been a very, very helpful hearing. Ms. Bride,